So they don't say that we have Latin American time. I'm going to read. It's not the most pedagogical thing, so otherwise I forget and I start to talk very fast and it's a distraction. My name is Carlos de la Torre. I am the director for the Center for Latin American Studies. And I am very happy and proud to welcome you to this book launch and celebration. I am happy and proud to welcome Patricia Richards, Professor of Sociology and Gender Studies at the University of Georgia, is the author of one of my favorite books on indigenous people and neoliberalism. Her book is entitled Race in the Chilean Miracle. It's on the resistance of the Mapuches to the expropriation of natural resources. Rebecca Hanson is a faculty here for the Center for Latin American Studies in the Department of Sociology. She's an expert on Venezuela and she has several years of experience in the field doing fieldwork in one of the most dangerous places in the world, Caracas. The volume that we're celebrating today is entitled Harassed, Gender Bodies and Ethnographic Research, published recently by California University Press. They argue that the androcentric, racist, and colonialist epistemological foundations of ethnography contribute to silencing sexual harassment and other forms of violence against women. I am also very happy because we're starting a new tradition in the center. We will have academic celebrations of the books published by our faculty. In February 14, we will celebrate Lene Ureña's book, Colonial Fantasies, Imperial Realities, Race Science, and the Making of Polishness in the Fringes of the German Empire. Academia, as we all know, is full of rituals. Some are not that great, and I will not talk about those horrible rituals of academia, but some rituals are fantastic, and one is one of those, because we like to celebrate our colleagues' accomplishments, and celebrating their accomplishments makes the Day of the Director a wonderful day. Please join me to welcome Professor Hanson, Richards, and the book discussant, Dr. Kendall Board from the Center of Gender, Sexuality, and Women Studies, and Dr. Randall Contreras from the University of California, Riverside. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you guys so much for being here. I always feel like it's such a treat to have another opportunity to talk about this project and this book. So thank you so much for showing up, and I'm really excited to hear questions, comments, particularly from our wonderful commentators, but also from you guys. So we'll get started off with Patricia and I, since we don't assume everyone in here has bought or read the book. We'll start off with kind of just like introducing what some of the themes are, what some of the motivations for writing the book, and then turn it over to Kendall Broad and Randall Contreras for comments, and then open up for Q&A. So, and then Patricia will be starting us off.
Okay. I have my mic attached. Okay, I'll just echo Becca and say thanks to y'all for coming out this afternoon. Our objective in this project has been to use women's experiences with harassment in the field not to come up with a series of tips and strategies for dealing with it, but rather to interrogate the epistemological foundations of ethnographic methodology and the silences that they reproduce in our own discipline of sociology, as well as in qualitative research more generally. So our findings are based on 56 interviews with a diverse sample of mostly women and a few men. The women in our sample experienced different types of sexual harassment and other unwelcome behaviors in the field, ranging from light flirtation and sexual banter to assault, and in one case, rape. We identified 3 intersecting standards: solitude, danger, and intimacy, that our participants made recourse to when talking about disciplinary expectations for what makes good ethnographic research. Becca and I refer to these standards as fixations because of the importance that the women that we interviewed placed on them and their perception that they were fundamental standards held by the larger ethnographic community. However, the valorization of these standards doesn't exist just in the minds of the women that we interviewed. They were reinforced by their coursework, by the ways they were or were not mentored, and by the ethnographies that are commonly held up as exemplars in the discipline. So just briefly, solitude refers to the value that's placed on going into the field and withstanding the difficulties of ethnographic fieldwork alone. Danger refers to the belief that worthwhile ethnographic research requires facing hazards in the fields and doing anything for the data. And intimacy, which is frequently held up as the approach that can create access to the best data, refers to the idea of becoming as close as possible with research participants by spending as much time as possible with them. While it's clear from our interviews that the fixations worked against women in the field and did so in ways that intersect with race, sexual identity, and other factors, we don't focus on women's experiences because only knowledge produced by women is structured or negatively impacted by these fixations. Rather, by examining the experiences of women ethnographers, which, like those of scholars who are not white and queer scholars, have been marginalized in the dominant canon, we can better understand and identify the underlying assumptions about the construction of ethnographic knowledge. So we propose two interrelated explanations for why these fixations may have stuck with the women we interviewed, becoming particularly salient when negotiating problems in the field. First, the ongoing dominance of the white heteromasculine perspective in academia has a silencing effect on women after they have experienced unwanted sexual contact in the field. Of course, there are more women, LGBTQ folks, and people of color in academia now than a few decades ago, but this has not dislodged the methodological expectations and epistemological standards that came out of straight white men's fieldwork. And grad school often teaches silences about these issues. So for example, Bridget, who's a Black sociologist that we interviewed, told us that she learned how to laugh off harassment when she faced it in the field from her experiences being harassed by her male professors in grad school. When faced with harassment in the field, many participants reverted to epistemological assumptions rooted in the experiences and worldviews of white male heterosexual elites about how the construction of knowledge is supposed to proceed. And the fixation with intimacy is a particularly good example. As sociologist Laura Rico has pointed out, the emphasis on the body as a tool with which ethnographers can achieve intimacy elides the different challenges that researchers will encounter precisely due to what their particular bodies signify. And secondly, really an extension here of the first point, concerns that the academic community might consider their research polluted or invalid led some of our participants to avoid talking openly about their experiences with harassment and other sexualized experiences in the field. So I'll turn it over to Becca to finish this off.
So what we argue in the book, kind of finishing up Patricia's thought, is that this self-imposed silence that we're discussing really demonstrates the degree to which women ethnographers can oftentimes consciously or unconsciously become carriers of a discourse that really marginalizes our own experiences, right, in the methodological literature. And there's good reason for them doing this, right, for some of the reasons that Patricia's already mentioned. But we had other participants who discussed their experiences with harassment, with peers and mentors and advisors, and sometimes they were supported by these people, and other times they weren't. So one of the examples that we talk about in the book is an example of Munira, who was a practicing Muslim woman when she was conducting her research. At the time, she was in the phase of recruiting people that she was going to be interviewing, and after meeting with a man to kind of do a pre-interview before really deciding to include him in her sample, she offered to take him home in her car because he didn't have the way to get home. While they were in the car, the man tried to touch her hair under her hijab and asked a lot of really invasive questions about her religious practices. So she decided to leave him out of her sample, out of her study, after she, and using her words, felt that the man was too creepy to really want to interact with again. So she talked about this experience in a class that she had, and another man who was in the class told her that she was doing bad research because she had decided to leave someone out of her sample for this reason, and those were the words that he used in the class towards her. So Patricia has talked about these interrelated explanations that we give in the book. So what I'm going to do to kind of wrap up is talk a little bit about the implications that we argue that these fixations have for the construction of ethnographic knowledge, and I'll just mention two here to not take up too much of our time. So first, we suggest that interactions that bring sex, gender, and body to the fore are often become residual data or ignored altogether. So despite the fact that, as we argue in the book, these are really important data to understand how ethnographic knowledge is produced, it kind of gets pushed aside and marginalized, right? So most of the participants, including myself, were very blindsided in their experiences, and as a result, tried to ignore or set them aside. So we borrow Joan Fujimura's term for the data that scientists misrecognize because they don't fit with their pre-established categories of analysis, and refer to these experiences as awkward surplus. So these experiences we don't really know what to do with because they don't seem to really have anything to do with our research topics get put into this category of awkward surplus. Participants often describe sexual harassment and other sexualized interactions as just another part of life as an ethnographer, something that was present and bothersome, but not necessarily examined reflexively. And because these interactions don't seem, again, directly relevant to our research topics, they can be perceived as unimportant. And then, of course, there's the question, why shouldn't they be? If we're not talking about them in methods classes, if we're not talking about them in our methods texts, the message that we're sending is that these are unimportant pieces of data, right? So in retrospect, experiences like these, when we do go back and think about them reflexively, show us that they often shape the ethnographer's trust in her participants, as well as how she chooses to interact with her research participants in the future. So they matter for this reason. And allowing these interactions to be set aside means that some research opportunities are unconsciously avoided. So less time is spent with certain research participants, and certain research sites are removed in favor of others that felt safer. When participants did bring up experiences of harassment to faculty members, most of them that we talked to, the responses they often received fell within this category of awkward surplus, implicitly or explicitly encouraging them to ignore harassment. So participants oftentimes recalled advisors telling them to suck it up, or laughed at their stories of harassment, as if they were just one more awkward moment or uncomfortable situation that all ethnographers face in the field. I did this myself before talking to Patricia about my experiences in the field. The only way I knew how to kind of bring up these experiences that I was having consistently with a faculty member was to bring them up as kind of like a joke. It was like, oh, listen to this like weird thing that's happening to me, and kind of laugh it off myself, right? So the second thing that I'll mention is that despite, as Patricia has mentioned, there has been a growing emphasis within sociology on reflexivity and positionality. What we argue in the book is that the ongoing influence of these three ethnographic fixations that Patricia talked about still leads to a superficial attention to the effects of the researcher's embodiment in the field. So as Christine Kalansky has observed, it's as if, it is as if the body, once acknowledged, can be then written out of our work, right? So we can deal with it in the methods section and then kind of leave it or push it aside for the rest of our work. So when we write about race, class, and gender in the field as obstacles over which we have to prevail or set aside or ignore, we miss, as Kristen Schultz and Christine Williams have written, the opportunity to reflect on how being a gender or race, class, etc. outsider impacts the actual process of field research. It's worth mentioning here again, as Kimberly K. Wong and others have suggested, that it's people of color and women who are more likely to have their work questioned for these reasons, often because of their particular ways in which they are embodied, right? So there can be a real risk for us in accounting for these issues in our texts. So we seem to both expect, quote unquote, others to be more reflexive and then punish them for doing it. And Randall does a really fantastic job in his first book, The Stick Up Kids, talking about this issue, I think, and the kind of challenges and questions that he got being a Dominican man and studying other Dominican men. So I highly recommend his book for thinking about this. So the answer then that we argue in the book is not to jettison reflexivity or deal with it in this really superficial manner, but to work to change prevailing ethnographic standards that penalize those who can never measure up to this dominant archetype that Patricia was talking about. So in conclusion, the incongruence between these ethnographic standards and the embodied reality of fieldwork is elucidated when we examine the experiences of those who've historically not been included in setting them. By fetishizing a particular type of ethnographic journey, which is what we argue is still happening in methods, classes, and literature, the three fixations we identify limit the ways in which we can envision thinking about gathering good data and producing good research. So it's our hope that this study will push all researchers, not just women, to consider how their embodiment influences the data they collect and the relationships that they build in the field. But then we also call for sociological ethnography as a field in and of itself to stop fixating on danger, the solitary researcher, and intimacy above both safety as well as more complete tales of the field. Thank you.
Turning on the mic, can you hear me? So my name is Kendall Broad, and thank you for the opportunity to join you today. I'm very pleased that this is a celebration of the book, because I feel like since I've read it, I've been celebrating it and telling everybody about it. And so I'm going to start my comments. I'm going to start the comments, my comments today, in sort of that celebratory spirit, and then I'll move into talking a little bit about some of the things I wish they'd done a little more of, and some of the things that the book makes me think about in relationship to some wider conversations. So let me start. I feel like this is making. Is the mic okay? Okay. I feel like I was getting feedback. So the introduction, I think, of the book, you lay out very clearly what you state are the three primary interventions you want to accomplish in the book. And so they state they want to fill a gap in qualitative research addressing sexual harassment and violence in the field. They want to call for a transformation of ethnography as a profession towards a focus on the principal tool of research, the body. And they want to create a case study of sexual harassment in academia. And so the thing, when I finished the book, I thought, well, did they accomplish these interventions? And I would say unequivocally yes. First, by theoretically, methodologically, and pedagogically arguing for an embodied approach to ethnography that makes transparent power and its manifestations, they provide the field of qualitative research a needed intervention on how to write in the sexual harassment and violence of our worlds. They fill a gap with their contribution of a method of embodied reflexivity. Secondly, by empirically providing a portrait of how the field of ethnography, especially in sociology, still operates with these ethnographic fixations rooted in androcentric and positivist standards that erase embodied knowledge while also providing empirical examples of the scope of that erasure. They effectively call out the field or call it in. And I'll get back to that in a bit. And they set the stage for serious transformation that centers the body. And third, by doing good, solid qualitative research with 56 interviews and careful, nuanced, and intersectional qualitative analysis rooted in core concepts of a complex gender sociology, they provide a piercing portrait of sexual harassment in academia. It is a #MeToo qualitative portrait, a very effective one. But I think their work does so much more than just accomplish these aims. And so I just want to take a moment and read to you a couple things that I love about this work. I love that it's based on qualitative research and qualitative researchers. I think that's very clever, and it was very effective. I love that it situates the problem in academia as a strategy of problematizing and countering the colonial legacy of ethnography, and also holding academia accountable to analysis of power and needing to address sexual harassment and violence. I love that the material of the book, what makes it, is the material we have edited out of our work and our methods. I love that it's grounded in feminist methodology, taking up key thinkers in sociology, Dorothy Smith in particular, while still arguing very successfully that there's important room for taking it further and much further. I love how the book points out that women mostly still evaluate our own projects with criteria that obscures sex, gender, harassment, and violence, even after the reflexive turn, even after the profound development of qualitative methods beyond androcentric and positivist models. I love that the book provides data to show that we still hold ourselves to these standards and are held to these standards with significant consequences. I love that the book holds at center complex understandings of gender, writing of gendered meanings and practices, and not simply gender to remind readers, and not simply gender, and remind readers that gender does not exist outside discourse, performance, and symbolic logics. I love that the analysis of how gendered power plays out in research, ethnography, and academia pays attention to gender interactionally and institutionally, and thinks of change on those terms as well. I love how they acknowledge that doing gender is appropriate in ways, I love how they acknowledge that doing gender in appropriate ways is essential for doing field work, and how the standards for doing gender vary. This is something I so often discuss with graduate students doing research, and is so often some of the hardest stuff. I love the clear definitions of sexual harassment and violence they name, while also clearly showing how messy it is in the field, how messy it is as lived and experienced. I love how they treat seriously confidentiality, all the while calling for embodied ethnography and transparency, and how they model the very careful and complicated balance between those. I love that this then allows the book to operate as an example of how one does it, as they argue for the necessity of both. I love the balance between being theoretical, epistemological, empirical, and offering the nuts and bolts and suggested reflections for teaching and learning, and they offer that throughout the book. I could go on. There's more that I love, but let me stop there. Let me mention just a couple things that I wish they could have developed more, and I know a book can only be so long, so they had to make some choices. I wanted Hanson and Richards to spend more time addressing why the dominant episteme still stands. They provide us with a rich empirical portrait of how it manifests through ethnographic fixations of assuming good ethnographic research is done in solitude and is dangerous and intimate. But I wanted more discussion of why, after the reflexive turn, we are still facing this. They provide some answer with Dorothy Smith and the ideological forms and the persistence of colorblind and powerblind sociology. But I kept thinking about how they would enter the conversations going on about why, after such a significant reflexive turn in qualitative research, after such important work from critical race scholars, feminists, indigenous researchers, queers, that we have come back to or still exist with standards of a neutral researcher, a powerless field, and disembodied knowledge. I think of conversations about the neoliberalizing of education and academia and the consequences thereof. I think of conversations by some Black and brown and anti-racist white feminists pointing out the flattening and whitening of intersectional research by academia, of academia as a void or an abyss, dismantling critical knowledge projects. The authors argue that androcentric, colonial, racist, heteronormative, positivist standards persist. Well, I think some of these others that I'm gesturing to, these others' conversations, also say that, but they're, I think, pushing it a little further and talking about how these dynamics are being strengthened and changing. And I wonder how the authors think of their work in relationship to those conversations. A second point, while the authors wrote and cautioned about the costs of harassment and violence, especially in their chapter 4, I wanted them to also discuss the costs of writing the awkward surplus into the data and how people negotiated that. I was really struck by their reference to Huang's award-winning ethnographic work at the end as an example of a researcher who wrote in some of that awkward surplus and how she negotiated what she was going to write in and what she wasn't in her own embodied ethnography. It made me remember her work in dealing with desire and how Huang wrote about her advisor, Ray Garay, telling her to be sure to desexualize her body and make sure her work demonstrated empirical and theoretical rigor when she presented it, because otherwise audience members would ask questions about her positionality, sexualize her body, and ultimately delegitimate her project, and how then Huang says that Ray was right. And so she talks about how this led then to her own standpoint crisis, wherein, following the model of Contreras and asking who really benefits from a reflexive turn to address positionality, she herself ultimately decides not to disclose whether she had engaged in sex work as part of her embodied ethnography of desire. A decision tied to her understanding of how, as she put it, racialized, gendered, and class relations differentially reward and discipline white scholars as opposed to scholars of color and male and female scholars from diverse backgrounds. And so in thinking about and remembering her work in relationship to this book, I wanted to hear more about how researchers, as authors, negotiated safe boundaries for what to write and what to include in their writing, and where they made decisions and how they made decisions to be safe and define boundaries when they were making decisions about including that awkward surplus. I think the authors, third point, I think the authors could have pushed some of their intersectional analysis a bit more. They write eloquently about it in terms of women and men of color, but I found myself at times asking, what about queers of color? Also, is Kista the only lesbian? They return to an example of Kista many times in ways that made me want to hear more. But more so, I really hope the authors would have developed the idea of youth as a significant intersection. They allude to it. It seems they talk about it early in the data, mentioning that mostly grad students and young assistant professors faced particular circumstances. And they mention it especially in regard to Dr. Hanson's own experience and how she was negotiating some of this in her early 20s while doing research. And so they seem to be saying themselves that it's central, that age is central. And so I think further discussion of how youth and ageism play out, especially when intersecting with gender and harassment and violence and embodiment and professional and racialized sexism, is a point that could have been teased out and untangled a little bit more. And one more point, in reading this work, it made me, again, and maybe it's because I love Gloria Gonzalez-Lopez's work that I again thought of her work, but it did make me think of her work and her discussion of the epistemology of the wound and the way our field relations, and she came to understand through her work how our field relations sometimes demand of us different interactions and responses and roles than we anticipate. I think of how Gonzalez-Lopez talked about becoming a witness to stories of abuse in addition to being a researcher through her own research, and how she came to hold those responsibilities as part of her knowledge project. Crucially, I think of how she traced how it took a while to realize that and to digest and understand that. And so I wonder about how Richards and Hanson emphasize in the book really how to do preparation before the field, and some about how to get support as one is in the field through collaboration. But I kept also wondering about what about after the field? And I feel like that is something the authors could develop a bit more. How do we take that time and that energy and get away and reflect and rethink and recover to write about that awkward surplus so it isn't perhaps so awkward in the end? I want to make two more final comments about how I think about what the authors are contributing in relationship to some wider conversations. So the book makes me think of a wider conversation or wider conversations about sociology and disciplinarity more generally. I read the book as holding not just ethnographers to task, but also sociology and that project of disciplinary knowledge production. It makes me think of other methodological work calling out and to some degree calling in sociology. So I think of the collection of queer methods in sociology by Compton, Meadow, and Schilt. And I think of how Schilt, in describing her effort to do transgender sociology, confronted and talks about facing repeated messages that her work was not sociology, and how she names this as a form of disciplinary gatekeeping. I think also of the way in which Ward in that same collection faced repeated method-splaining in response to her interdisciplinary queer work, and how she similarly names it as a kind of disciplinary gatekeeping. And I think of how at the end of that collection, some then suggest that the way forward is to become rogue scholars, doing sociology based on an epistemology of complexity, perhaps outside of disciplinary bounds, as a form of, say, radical critical interdisciplinarity. And I pondered this as I read Hanson and Richards' work and wondered if they saw that as the way forward, or were they calling for more of an expansion of what is sociology, what is disciplinary work, like the way that Zuberi and Bonilla Silva in their edited volume, White Logic, White Methods, do so by calling for a move away from the white logic of sociology, for example, to do a better critical disciplinary research, as they argue, by embracing an epistemology of racial emancipation with work that is race-affirming and race-conscious. Maybe, and the authors can probably talk about this, their book is calling for both. Really a call to dialogue, or a call for a different sociology, a different approach to disciplinarity, and also a call to do so in dialogue with ethnographers across fields. And that's sort of what I came to. Let me close by saying a few final comments. Very brief. I will tell others to read this book. I have to. And to take time reading it. It triggers, and I say that word purposely. It triggers memories and rethinking, and it's more than a methods book. Or perhaps we should think of it as the best kind of methods book. I also think it should be read in groups, perhaps in feminist community. The authors throughout call for collaborative research as a strategy to move towards supportive, sane, and embodied ethnography. And I've come away from the book thinking it also demands a collaborative read, and maybe this venue is the first step towards that. I'll stop there. Do you want to use this one?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can't juggle, so I might not be able to scroll and hold the mic at the same time. Okay. Well, first, I would like to thank Rebecca and Patricia for inviting me to critique this book. I'll say from the start, this is a wonderful book that I would recommend to anyone, at least at the graduate level, at least, but to anyone who is teaching, field research methods or teaching qualitative methods. The book raises many issues that a lot of instructors ignore when teaching methodology courses. And I know that in the research-related courses that I took as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, we never discussed the experience of gender in the field. And I actually took a graduate ethnography course with a well-respected, well-established, well-rewarded ethnographer. But I remember that we had no readings on gender. And as far as I can recollect, we had no discussions of gender in the field. But I'm really happy to have this book right now, which will put everything into better perspective, especially when teaching methods to my own students, because this book has me thinking about positionality even more in terms of being in the field and being in academia. And so as I make comments on the book, I'll discuss some of my own experiences as an ethnographer, as it was suggested that I do when I was invited to be a critic. So now first, the authors, they mentioned that many of the study participants, they hesitate to include in their text the sexual and gender dynamics inherent in the field. Instead, they produce a traditional type ethnography that makes them appear as much as possible as neutral and objective. And they do this despite being familiar with the feminist literature, with the critical race literature, with the post-colonial literature that challenged traditional ethnography, and that challenged the ethnography that the ethnographer that presents themselves as being absent or hardly intervening in the field. And they do this because they're afraid. They're afraid that any departures from traditional ethnography, any departures from the conventional white male presence or the conventional white male voice will have colleagues dismiss their scholarship. And they're afraid that if they disclose their gendered experiences and struggles in the field, then they'll be seen as weak, as pathetic, as though they're not cut out for careers in ethnography. And this feeling of fear, as I was reading this, it resonated with me. Because I wrote my own ethnography on Dominican drug robbers in the South Bronx, I struggled about whether I should produce a traditional ethnography despite not being a traditional researcher. Because most of the well-respected ethnographers, especially in sociology, they're white upper middle class men who don't look like me, act like me, or move like me. And so given that I'm a minority who came up in the South Bronx to poor Dominican immigrant parents, and I grew up in poverty, I attended the worst public schools, I taught different, I dressed different, and I wrote in a way that reflected my marginal social position in the world. And in thinking about all of this, I became afraid. In fact, I reached what I call a standpoint crisis. I was afraid that if I wrote about the relationship between myself, the field site, my study participants, and the research process overall, I feel in a complete and truthful way, then I feared that my work would be cast aside and that I would be viewed negatively. But in the end, I decided to produce an ethnography that took my positionality into account and that showed how it shaped not only my choices in theory and analysis, but also the type of language that I used to write about the people that I studied. And throughout it all, I discussed my fears about my place in academia. I discussed my fears about disclosing my previous drug market participation, especially as a crack dealer. And I even discussed my fears about my safety while doing the research. And after reading my book, a lot of people criticized me. I mean, they did it with kindness, right? They said that my book was a great autobiography, or that it was a great autoethnography. That's like a curse word, among mainstream sociologists. And one person even told me that now I have to study people outside of my community so that I could prove myself as a researcher. However, there were others that did appreciate my disclosures of my insiderness and the disclosures of my doubts and uncertainty throughout the research. And they called me honest, they called me sincere, and they called me courageous for not being afraid to present myself as vulnerable. And I even had several women grad students and assistant professors, all of color, reach out to me, and they thanked me for discussing my positionality in relationship to the academic world. And then they asked me for advice on how to discuss their own positionality in their own ethnographies. And my advice was always to be honest about one's experiences, but to only include the personal matters that directly relate to the research. But I always knew that my advice was easier said than done. Although I was congratulated for presenting myself as vulnerable, I knew that it was different from my women colleagues. Anything that they said about their fears and uncertainty could be used against them. Could be used to reinforce the negative stereotypes of women as being too emotional, too fearful, and too helpless. Because I knew that when women revealed uncertainty and vulnerability, it would be perceived as a sign of weakness. On the other hand, based on my experience, it seemed that when men did the same, it would be perceived as a sign of strength. There seemed to be a double standard, and I could only conclude that I had male privilege in this instance. So I wondered whether it was appropriate for me to give women advice on such matters, because I wasn't in their same position. And so that's why I'm really happy with this book. I think that this book can help everyone, regardless of gender, to understand and reflect on what it means to be gendered in the field and in academia. And it also shows how field research is embodied, and it makes this case for writing about the experience, and not only in the methodology section, but also in the text. I mean, I always knew that women had to think about sex and gender dynamics in their research, but I never knew how much. Because such issues only arise for men occasionally. And when we think about it, how many men ethnographers have gatekeepers, have study participants, have state officials sexually harass them, or sexually assault them, or mention desires for sex with them? Not many. And I found it terrible that women ethnographers feel a need to hide how gender shapes the research data and analysis. The experiences of women ethnographers not only provide tremendous insight into methodology, but also show how gender pervades field sites. So they can use their personal experiences to enhance a gender analysis, or include an analysis, a gender analysis, even if they hadn't planned to do one. Now, one of the biggest lessons that I learned from the book is that dangerous research does not only entail studying groups such as rebel guerrillas or terrorist organizations or criminal and violent people like the drug robbers I studied in the past or the gang members that I'm studying now. Danger looms for women ethnographers studying almost any group, any institution, any organization, at almost any time and any place. And the women's accounts of sexual harassment in the book and their accounts of sexual assault, they were really revealing, they were really troubling. And they showed how spaces that we often think to be safe, especially for women holding the status of research or academic, how these spaces can double as spaces of gender violence and victimization. And it was incredible to learn that male gatekeepers often expect sex in return for access to study participants. And that's something I can't fathom ever happening to me in any of my research pursuits. And a powerful line in the book, one that just stopped me in my tracks as I was reading, is when a study participant said on page 141, "I feel like this body is a liability." And this is something that most men don't feel. Men probably feel that their bodies are possibilities rather than liabilities. But one thing that came to mind when reading about how women present themselves as unfazed ethnographers to gain approval from the academic world is my observation of how men ethnographers, especially men who are insiders to their crime-related research, how they often do the same, but they actually take it up a notch. I've heard many conversations among the new generation of ethnographers, men ethnographers, where they often evaluate each other based on whether they're real or not. And by real, they mean whether or not someone really participated in crime and violence, or whether or not someone was really a gang member, or whether or not someone is or was part of the criminal life that they once, that they now study. And I've heard them criticize others, calling them fake, calling them phony, calling them wannabes who are exaggerating their previous criminal life. And this criticism is all about taking this masculine presentation of self in research and then squaring it or multiplying it by 10. Because here, the measure of whether someone carried out research properly or even qualifies for doing crime research or crime ethnography is the degree to which they have ever performed a violent, aggressive, or risk-taking masculinity. And this is the worst way to measure a study. Because displaying hypermasculinity does not equal using theory properly, or methods properly, or doing analysis properly, or doing, using data properly, or even writing properly. It's more about announcing to the world that one is a bad man, about creating an even deeper masculine distinction within the academic world. Or perhaps it's just a lamentation for their perceived loss of masculinity as newly minted academics. As academics, we don't dunk basketballs. We don't hit and tackle others to the ground. We don't fight others, in a boxing ring or in a cage. Instead, we mostly read, we mostly write, we mostly teach, and pursuits that most people would hardly consider as masculine, right? As one of my study participants in my drug robbery research reminded me, and he's always reminding me, even to this day, he's giving me these little reminders. He once said, "Yo, Ren, man, women like dudes with street smarts, not book smarts." And so this was his way of letting me know that as an academic, I was no longer, in his view, a real man. And so like my study participants, the men ethnographers are perhaps trying to hold on to this idealized hypermasculine image, especially as they begin navigating this new and really extremely square world. But I've also heard several men criticize prominent women ethnographers. And I've heard lots of criticism of one particular ethnographer, Kimberly Wang. In her wonderful ethnography, Dealing in Desire, she studied different types of Vietnamese sex hostesses at bars that catered to different types of men in Vietnam. And she studied women who served as bar companions, sometimes as paid sex companions, for wealthy Vietnamese men, Vietnamese American men, and Western men. And the critique that I've heard from men colleagues is that Kimberly didn't do real sex work research. And by real, they mean that she didn't spend time with sex workers on the street, the ones that live perilous lives because of hardcore drug use and frequent victimization. And as two colleagues argued in private, Kimberly didn't experience the gritty street life, where sex workers sleep on the streets, where they leave themselves on the streets, and where they spend their days, injecting themselves with heroin. And so for them, Kimberly didn't do real research, since she chose to spend time with sex workers indoors in an environment that was perceived to be safer. The problem is that these criticizers, they never read the book. So it was really inappropriate for them to assume that her research wasn't done properly. Also, they were ignorant of how women, as Harassed shows, women, no matter what they research, they often faced the potential for sexual harassment and for sexual assault, which men, again, as the book shows, rarely experience. Kimberly had to deal with men constantly evaluating and commenting on her body negatively. She had to deal with men constantly groping her body, an invasive act that she had to allow so that she could continue and complete her research. And she was also dealing with wealthy businessmen who were connected to the state. And so she really had to be careful in all of her interactions. She had to be careful with the words that she used to avoid having the state make false allegations about her in order to silence her through incarceration or potentially through killing her. But what if, hypothetically, Kimberly faced no danger? Why would Kimberly's research be less worthy then? Shouldn't we be measuring whether she accomplished her theoretical and analytical goals rather than if she put herself in danger? Because her goal was to intersect the global statuses and identities of certain nations to the on-the-ground race and gender experiences of Vietnamese sex bar hostesses and their clients. And I believe that she did a superb job in meeting her goals, and that her book is an exemplar on how to do theoretical ethnography. And danger has nothing to do with my assessment. And danger should have nothing to do with the assessment of anyone who disagrees with me. Now, the last thing I would like to talk about in Harassed is how the women participants felt that disclosing their uncertainties and their failures in the field could harm their careers. For instance, they felt that their colleagues, regardless of gender, they felt that they would view disclosures of vulnerability as incompetence. But I wish that Rebecca and Patricia would have dug deeper on what the negative consequences look like, or what the study participants perceived those negative consequences to be. Was it just reputational harm? Was it harm that makes it hard to publish research? Was it harm that makes it hard to get a job or to get tenure, to get promotions? Because in my case, I certainly experienced the same fears, and I feared that my work would not become a part of the academic conversation revolving around minorities, marginal minorities and crime. And later, I struggled to secure a field site for gang research in Los Angeles, and it took me a really long time. It took me about over 2 years to secure a field site to do gang research. I feared that I would be perceived as a failure within the academic world, that I would be perceived as a minority scholar who accomplished field research in their own community, but then failed miserably to accomplish field research in an outside community. That I failed to follow the path of the elite white male ethnographers who are lauded and praised. But my fears also related to the tangible. If I didn't get a new project going, I feared that I wouldn't get tenure. And starting a new qualitative project, especially an ethnographic project, it's really time consuming. You have to work really hard to get access to a field site, and then when you get access to that field site, you have to work hard to, as you mentioned in the book, to get people to like you. And sometimes they don't have to like you. And you don't have to like your study participants either. But you want to get you want to get them to trust you, so they can give you at least more sincere information. And then you have to write up field notes, and then if you have no funding, you have to transcribe all the interviews that you conducted. And then once you do that, you have to code and analyze your data, and then you can start writing up research articles for publication, or start writing up a book manuscript. And this whole process, even if it runs smoothly, it takes a few years. And if it doesn't run smoothly, leave out there, forget about it. You're in trouble. You're really in trouble, and that's where that fear comes from. And so when I read the accounts of your study participants, especially the women who had to exit the research entirely because of the sexual abuse and psychological trauma that they experienced, I could only imagine their concerns. But I would have liked to learn more about what they thought to be the specific consequences for being truthful about their experiences, or for exiting a field site without completing the study. I'll end by saying that I'm truly grateful to both of you for writing this book. It's extremely useful, and I cannot imagine ever teaching a qualitative methods course or a field research course without it, because for me it fills that gap that I can't speak to because of my positionality. It answers many questions involving the experiences of women in the field, especially as it relates to the dangers that they hardly ever speak about or write about. And it would be great if your next step is to expand that brief section in your book on page 88 and then on 171 through 174 that discusses how to incorporate oneself into the text to show how our bodies shape the research and analysis. And this could actually be expanded into your second book. I'm already making plans. Because many graduate students and early career scholars, I mean, they would really love to learn how to do it. And I think that's something you would mention. Okay, thanks.
Just for all of the wonderful feedback, so I appreciate that so much. And in terms of thinking about the next steps for the project, which is something we have been talking about a lot. So I really, really appreciate the kind of thoughts about what steps to take moving forward. So I think what I'll do is probably just try to answer a couple of things within a really compressed answer, and then maybe Patricia will do the same, and we can do a Q&A. So I think hopefully what I'm about to say will maybe get at the negative consequences for women after coming out of the field, which Kendall, you mentioned, as well as kind of maybe addressing more of like what these what women think about what these negative consequences you mentioned, Randall, and then hopefully maybe think a little bit about like why this how this continued reproduction of the white cisgender man ethnographer, the neutral body, has continued on. So here we go. So the way that I'm gonna, I think, respond to that is should just kind of talk about my own experience maybe with some of these concerns. So I think that the question about, and I wish we had a bit more time thinking about kind of these costs coming out of the field. For me, it was spending a lot more time in grad school because it was really, really hard to go back to that data. I mean, it took, in a lot of ways, feel like this project that saved me psychologically, because basically what I did was take 2 years off from looking at my dissertation data and work on this project, and then went back to the dissertation project and started working on that, right? But that also means that I spent a lot more time in grad school, which was an issue that came up when I was on the job market. Like people were asking like why we were in grad school for so long, right? And then that gets into questions like how deeply do you want to respond to that question when you're trying to get a job, and then also dealing with I think still a lot of the insecurities and vulnerabilities that come up for you when you have these experiences, and then kind of being thrust into, and we mentioned this briefly in the book, but I don't think we've developed it enough, but basically being thrust back into academia where you're being asked to present yourself as a competent professional who has a handle on all aspects of your life and theory and methodology and all of these things, right? So that I think trying to figure out how to balance the impacts, these costs when you come back, with having a successful academic career is something that we need to think a lot more about. And so I think I'll just wrap that up. I'm not sure how good of a job I did answering those two questions, but I'll wrap that up by saying I think that probably one of the reasons, because of like these costs of, the women that we talked to in terms of what they were worried about with talking about gender, sexuality, sexual harassment, I think were all of the things you mentioned, Randall, right? Like they were worried about publications, they were worried about how their professors would respond to them, they were worried about what this would do to them on the job market. We had one participant, this was actually after she participated in our study, submit to, and after having talked to us about some of the implications of the research, submit to her feminist journal and really trying to like incorporate herself in her data. And one of the reviewers comments back to her was, "I don't want to see so much of you in your data," and that was a feminist journal. So yeah, I think it covers all of those, all of the things that you hit on, and I think that one of the reasons why, even though we have all this amazing methodological literature that's come from like critical race scholars, from post-colonial scholars, queer theory, it's just like incredible the diversity of methodological literature that we have now, in terms of trying to think about why that hasn't seemed to have like really exploded all of these kind of like structures that we talk about in the book that continue to keep women from talking about these things, keep researchers from talking about their bodies in general. It's just an uncertainty of knowing who's going to be evaluating your work, right? That's the first thing that comes to my mind, right? It's like our academia is much more diverse now, obviously, than it was, not getting into discussions about diversity with the concept. But you know, it looks very different now than it did a number of decades ago, right? But you have no idea who's going to be on a tenure, who's going to be on your tenure committee, who's going to be on a job market or a job committee, right? Who's going to be reviewing your manuscript? And because we can't take for granted that the people who are reading our work are post-colonial scholars or queer scholars, right? We played the safest standards, I think. So just off the top of my head, that's it. It's like this uncertainty of knowing that you have the support to be able to talk about your research in this way. So again, thank you guys so much for the amazing comments.
Yeah, really fabulous comments, and you know, we're really honored by the time, you know, and energy y'all to put into doing this for us. And great questions and comments and critiques too. I think, you know, sort of building off of what Becca just said, though, I think the bodies of literature that you referred to, Kendall, about the neoliberalization of the academy and the flattening or whitening of intersectionality, you know, I think it would take me a really long time to really formulate what I think about that. But I do think that, you know, both of those phenomena really do add support to, like, undergird this more traditional model that we're critiquing, right? And they build it up in new ways so that everything is supposed to be very neatly measurable and so forth and fall into neat categories, and that you're supposed to have, you know, that, I don't know, like how many, I'm just thinking then in terms of the standards of evaluation, like how many tenure and promotion committees I've sat on where all we do is literally count. Like we just sit there and count how many articles people had. How many articles are we going to count? Does a book count as? You know, so like nobody's like even taking the time to read this stuff. I'm getting off on one of those tangents, but you know, I'm just thinking about the ways that things being countable in the neoliberal academy also kind of works against that reflexive turn, right? And it means that you have to produce stuff faster and more because all that really matters is numbers. So then that works, you know, the stuff that you were saying about taking a long time to get out of grad school, you know, like if you're actually going to grapple with this stuff, it's going to take time. But I think that another part of it is like just, you know, as we talk about some in the book, is this need to really think collectively about our standards of evaluation and how we determine the validity of work, and just the fact that, you know, people get, you know, responses to get the critique that there's that it's an autobiography or whatever, or even when we were trying to publish the article that the book that came out before the book, like it got rejected like 3 times. And 4, and I mean that's crazy. And I mean sometimes it happens, but we're like come on, this is a good article, but it's getting rejected. And to a sociology journal that shall go unnamed, but like they sent it to an additional reviewer so they could reject it. They had it went to 4 reviewers, 3 were positive, and then some dude just said it's not true, and they rejected it. So I think that those standards of how we determine a work's validity or value kind of collectively as a field is something that we really have to grapple with as part of this too. The youth question, you know, I was sitting there the other day working on a different talk based on this project, and I was like, why didn't we talk more about youth? But I think it was hard because, in part, because our sample really skewed young. Like most of the people who responded to our call were grad students and assistant professors, and so it was hard. But it wasn't that the women who were older weren't experiencing harassment in the field. They maybe had prior experiences, so they were less shocked by it. But it just was like I mean, it's still, it still happened. It was just like older dudes who were harassing you for the most part.
You had something.
Yeah,
Someone
right.
said sexual harassment doesn't stop. The men just get older along with you.
Yeah, exactly. And although I do think like the shock of it was, is less the older that you get, maybe, in a sort of sad way. The preparation kind of before, during, and after, how we recover, I think like the role of community is so important there, and some of our participants, as we talk about in the book, had developed ways to have community while they were in the field. So they had like there was a group of women who had they had like a monthly, like Skype date or something, like group of 4 women. They were like all over the world, and they would like check in with each other. But they also like had a rule where any of them could say like, I need a check-in, I'm really desperate here, can somebody talk to me? And like maybe not all 4 or 5 could show up, but at least some of them could. And I think that having that community after you're done with work is really important too. And to actually be having a community with which to reflect collectively on the experiences you had in the field, and to kind of continue to break down that solitude of what it means to do ethnographic work and to write it up and so forth. I think I'm going to stop there so we can take some more questions maybe.
And I'm just going to add one thing, just since you got to the youth part. Yeah, I think considering age is something that we absolutely need to think about moving forward with the next leg of the project. What I would say is I think we talked about this a little bit in terms of age matters, but it's kind of also your career position that seems to matter more. And I think that this gets to your point about the neoliberalization of the university, right? Because if you don't have a tenure track job, if you haven't gotten tenure yet, or if you're a graduate student, the cost of changing your project, particularly an ethnographic project where you spend so much time getting access and doing all of the things you need to do to actually start your data collection, all of those things just feel so precarious before you have any kind of job certainty, right? And given that job certainty is something that's becoming less and less available, I think, or less and less possible, is only going to exacerbate these problems that you were talking about. And I think you rightly mentioned the neoliberalization just exacerbating this so much. So I'm just going to add that.